Sterling Maddox stared at the horizon, where 70 Apache warriors sat their horses like figures carved from the earth itself, silent, motionless, watching. The kind of watching that burned hotter than any sun overhead. The kind that told a man he had stepped into something far larger than himself. Before we step deeper into Sterling's story, don't forget to like this video, leave us a comment about where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more frontier tales like this one. These stories live because of your voices, and we want to share every mile of this journey with you. Yesterday, the ridge had been empty. Yesterday, Sterling still had a horse beneath him and a long stretch of freedom ahead. Yesterday, he had made a choice that seemed simple. A wounded woman by a dried creek bed, fever burning her skin, blood seeping through a bandage that had already lost the fight. "Ayana," she had whispered, her name no louder than a breath. And Sterling had seen something in her dark eyes that stripped away every excuse to ride on. He gave her his horse, just handed over the only possession that meant survival in a land that did not forgive weakness. Led the animal on foot while she swayed in the saddle, drifting between pain and unconsciousness. 6 hours of rock and dust, his boots grinding the miles beneath him, his own throat parched while he guided her toward the safety of her people. At the boundary marked by 3 red stones, he had done something even he couldn't explain. He had slapped the horse's flank, sending it after her into Apache land, watching as his future disappeared in a cloud of dust. Now the price of that kindness loomed across the ridge. 70 warriors, each holding a single white feather. Not arrows, not lances, not war cries, just feathers lifted against the blue morning sky. Sterling had lived long enough on the frontier to know one truth: the Apache never moved without reason. And the silence they held around him felt sharper than any blade. He touched the empty holster at his side. Not for a weapon, he hadn't carried one since the war, but for reassurance. Even that felt absent. The sun crept higher, stretching shadows, long and lean between him and the warriors, and the weight of their gaze pressed harder on his chest. Something had been set in motion the moment he gave away his horse, something bound to laws he had never heard and couldn't hope to understand. When the lead warrior finally moved, gray streaking his black hair and a necklace of bones rattling softly against his chest, Sterling braced for the strike. But the man raised not a weapon, but a feather, and with deliberate steps descended the ridge. Behind him, the rest of the riders stayed frozen in formation, still as stone. Yet Sterling felt their attention like the pull of 100 hands. Every instinct in him screamed to run. But where does a man on foot run, 20 miles from the nearest settlement, with no water left and no horse under him? The warrior stopped 10 feet away. His eyes held no anger, no bloodlust, only a kind of expectation that chilled Sterling deeper than rage ever could. He spoke a single word in Apache, pointed to Sterling's chest, and repeated it, voice steady, solemn, reverent. Sterling didn't understand. He tried raising his hands, speaking the plain words of peace. "I don't want trouble. I helped because she was hurt. That's all." The warrior tilted his head, listening but not believing. He repeated the word again, this time pressing his hand to his heart, then gesturing towards the ridge where Ayana had vanished yesterday. Finally, he reached into a pouch and drew out something that made Sterling's blood run cold. The bridle from his horse, decorated now with painted symbols that had not been there before. The meaning was unmistakable. Sterling's act had been taken as something sacred, something bound to ritual older than any fence line or border. And when the warrior offered him a white feather, holding it in both hands with the weight of ceremony, Sterling knew that refusing would be worse than death. He reached out, trembling, and accepted. From the ridge, voices rose in song. Not a war song, he knew those sounds well, but something different. High, weaving tones that carried celebration, gratitude, and the sharp edge of mourning. The melody seeped into his bones, lifting the hair on his arms. Then from the canyon behind him came more voices, more figures. Women, children, an elder with a feathered headdress, and Ayanna herself, limping forward on her injured leg, her eyes heavy with gratitude and pity. Her grandfather, the elder, spoke words Ayanna translated with care. Sterling had given away his most valuable possession to save the life of an enemy. He had honored what they called the sacred law of the horse gift. And though he had not known the law, ignorance did not erase its binding power. He was now connected to Ayanna's people, bound by honor, and the bond demanded a choosing. At sunset, Sterling would either be welcomed as brother or condemned as enemy. There was no third path. He looked at the faces around him, the silent warriors, the children with wide eyes, Ayanna with her mixture of strength and sorrow, and felt a weight heavier than hunger or thirst. His life had narrowed to this, one act of kindness that had carried him across a line he hadn't seen, into a law he hadn't known, toward destiny he hadn't asked for. The white feather in his hand trembled as the wind moved across the ridge. He understood now what his mother used to say about choices, that sometimes they were doors, and once opened, you could never step back across. The choosing ceremony waited, and Sterling Maddox, once a solitary cowboy with nothing left to lose, was about to discover whether his heart was strong enough to carry the weight of 70 warriors, a sacred law, and a bond sealed by a horse he would never again call his own. The stone circle was finished by the time the sun dropped low enough to turn the sky the color of rusted iron, and Sterling Maddox found himself at its center, bound hand and foot, every muscle stiff from the ropes that bit into his skin. Yet the greater weight came from the eyes surrounding him. An entire village gathered with torches that flickered and cracked, their flames painting shadows across the faces of women, children, and warriors alike, all of them silent, all of them watching as though the measure of his heart could be read in the way he breathed. And beyond that inner ring stood the 70 horsemen, still arrayed in a perfect circle of their own, their white feathers glowing pale against the dusk, unmoving except for the gentle shift of hooves and the restless breath of their animals. And in the hush of that moment, Sterling felt stripped down to bone, as if every scar, every failure, every private regret had been brought into the open for strangers to see. And when the 5 elders settled opposite him, seated cross-legged on woven mats, with their faces painted in solemn designs, it was Ayanna's grandfather who carried the most gravity, his eyes old as dry stone, his shoulders squared beneath the feathered mantle that marked his authority. And though Sterling had known the silence of graves, the chill of winter camps, and the hot breath of enemies across battlefield smoke, he had never known silence like this, silence that pressed in like a living force until the old man spoke a single phrase in Apache, and Ayanna, standing tall despite her limp, translated softly into words that felt like a blade against his chest. "Tell us why you gave your horse to a woman you did not know, in a land where every step marked you trespasser. and every trespass promised death. Sterling swallowed against the dryness of his mouth, the raw knot of thirst in his throat, and for a moment he almost wished they would loose the arrows and have done with it, for speaking the truth seemed harder than dying under feathers and firelight. But he forced his voice to carry, telling them he had found Ayanna bleeding and fevered, that leaving her had felt wrong, that he had thought of nothing more than keeping her alive for another hour, another mile, and his words echoed in the circle with a plainness that felt naked, too thin to carry the weight of what they demanded. And almost at once the female elder leaned forward, her braids heavy with beads that clicked against each other as she spoke in sharp tones, her eyes narrow and unblinking. And Ayanna hesitated before translating. "If your wish was to help, why not take me to your own people, where white doctors and medicines could have saved me, where you would have been praised as hero by your kind? Why give me back to mine when it risked your life and cost your only horse?" The question burned through him, hotter than the ropes, for he had not shaped the answer clearly even to himself until that moment. Yet he knew it to be true. He said that she belonged with her people, that to take her away would have been another theft, another cruelty, that she deserved her own hearth fire, her own tongue, her own kin, and not to be paraded as proof of his conscience. And though his voice broke on the last words, the stillness of the gathered faces told him they had heard something they recognized, something that mattered. Yet another elder leaned forward, scarred arms crossed, eyes steady as the desert sky. And when he spoke, his tone was slower, deeper, the words heavier, even before Ayanna gave them shape in English. "You speak of cruelty to her, but what of cruelty to yourself? You gave away the only thing that stood between you and death in this country. 20 miles of hard ground with no water, no weapon, no hope. Was that kindness? Or was it punishment for guilt you already carried? Did you save her life, or did you simply decide your own wasn't worth the keeping?" The air seemed to leave Sterling's lungs at once, and images broke over him unbidden. The grave he dug for his sister, the rasp of her last breath while his hands had been empty, his parents laid low by fever, the ranch lost to drought, the long ledger of his failures that he never spoke aloud, but carried with him like stones tied to his chest. And for the first time, he saw himself not only as rescuer, but as a man who had sought redemption without knowing it, a man who had given away survival because he no longer believed he deserved it. And the honesty of that thought shook him raw. And when he whispered, "Maybe both," the words cracked like dry wood in fire, too brittle to carry the whole of it, yet truer than anything he had said before. The elders conferred then, voices low and measured, faces unreadable in the torchlight, while Sterling sat with his chest heavy, the sweat cooling against his back, knowing his whole life balanced on their judgment. Until at last, Ayanna's grandfather rose, his mantle stirring in the wind, and spoke a verdict that rippled through the crowd like a current in a river. And when Ayanna translated, her voice trembled, though her words were steady. "The elders believe your heart was true. You gave not for glory nor for reward, but from a place of pain and compassion joined. The first test is passed." A sigh of sound rose among the watchers, not quite applause, not quite song, but something older, and Sterling felt no triumph, only a kind of release that left him hollow and trembling. For truth had been demanded, and he had given it, stripped bare to strangers who saw in him what he had long refused to name. And when Ayanna looked at him across the firelit circle, her eyes shone with gratitude and sorrow together. as though she understood more than he wished revealed. Yet her grandfather's gaze did not soften, and his next words carried like a hammer against stone, heavy with the weight of ritual. And Ayana's translation fell like a sentence across Sterling's shoulders. Now comes the test of sacrifice, and this one will demand more than words. The words still rang in Sterling's ears. The test of sacrifice, when two young warriors stepped into the circle, carrying between them a long wooden box, their movements deliberate and reverent, as if they bore something far heavier than its size suggested. And when they set it down before the firelight, the crowd stirred with a low murmur, as though every watcher already knew what waited inside, and the weight of it pressed on them all. And Sterling, bound and weary, felt his chest tighten with a dread that no rope could match. For his heart told him, before the lid was even lifted, that this would not be a trial of strength alone, but one of choosing, and choosing was always the cruelest thing. The elder's hands, weathered and steady, opened the box, and within lay 5 arrows, each shaft smooth and straight, each fletched with feathers of a different color, and tied to each was a scrap of leather painted with symbols Sterling could not read. But the hush that fell across the circle told him the meaning was known. And when Ayana's grandfather spoke in tones deep and ceremonial, his granddaughter's translation trembled with reluctance, her eyes fixed not on the arrows, but on Sterling's face, as she said, "The test of sacrifice requires that you choose which of our people will face danger in your stead. 5 have stepped forward, 5 lives offered, each bound to 1 arrow. Each arrow marks a trial, and the one you choose must carry it out." At first, Sterling thought he had misheard, for the meaning was too brutal, too cold. Choose a stranger to risk their life for his acceptance, condemn someone else to pain for his deliverance. And his stomach clenched against the thought, but Ayana did not soften it, only lowered her gaze and added quietly, "This test measures whether you will place your own survival above the lives of others." "Most men do?" The elder lifted one of the arrows, red-fletched, and held it high, his voice carrying across the night, and Ayana named it the Rapids of Devil's Canyon, a crossing in darkness where many have drowned another arrow, fletched in black. The cave of the mountain cat, where only a stone from its deepest chamber will prove success. Then the white arrow, the cliff face our people call the wall of ghosts, unclimbed in living memory. The yellow arrow, the land of our enemies, where blood was spilled last spring. Walk there and return with proof of peaceful contact. And finally the blue arrow, and her voice faltered, to bear the arm to a rattlesnake's bite, trusting only to our medicines to survive. Each description fell like a stone into Sterling's gut, each one a near certain death. And when he looked up, he saw 5 figures stand from the crowd. A boy scarcely more than 16, his jaw set though his hands shook, a woman with kind eyes and a steady spine, a scarred warrior with years of battle across his body, a girl not yet grown, who reminded him cruelly of his sister, and a man close to Sterling's own age, whose wife clutched 2 children near the fire's edge. They stepped forward, not defiant, but resolved, each ready to carry the burden should Sterling point to them, each life waiting on the twitch of his lips, the nod of his head. The silence pressed in, heavy as lead. Sterling's breath came shallow, his chest burning as though the air itself had thinned. And in that moment he understood the cruelty of this test. It was not about survival, not about feats of strength or courage, but about the rot of selfishness, the temptation to say yes, let another bleed so I might live. And he felt the whole of his life, every moment of cowardice, every time he had chosen silence when truth was called for, every time he had watched another suffer while he held back, all of it gathering now like a noose around his throat, and he could not bear to add one more. I don't understand, he rasped, voice raw, though the words came more to himself than to Ayanna. How is this sacrifice when it asked me to spill the lives of others? Ayanna's eyes glistened, though her voice held firm. That is the question, Maddox. To choose quickly is to reveal selfishness. But there is another path, though no one has taken it in living memory. Her grandfather's gaze never wavered as he spoke again, and Ayanna's translation was scarcely above a whisper, yet it carried to every ear in the circle. You may refuse to choose. You may take all 5 trials upon yourself. To face them alone is certain death, but it will show the truth of your heart. The fire popped, sparks leaping into the dark, and Sterling felt every eye fixed tighter upon him, the weight of expectation pressing him down until he thought he would break. He looked at the boy with the trembling hands, at the woman whose children clung to her dress, at the scarred man whose life had already been given to battle, at the girl with her sister's eyes, and at the father with his family behind him. He saw in each face a life as fragile, as worthy as his own, and something inside him hardened, not like stone, but like iron, pulled hot from a forge, shaped by heat and hammered by loss. He thought of his sister's final breath, of her words that courage was not being unafraid, but doing right, even when fear ruled you. And he raised his head and spoke with a steadiness that surprised even himself. I will not choose. If blood must be risked, let it be mine. All 5 trials. Tonight, alone. The words rang into the circle and seemed to hang there, suspended between torchlight and shadow, until the murmurs rose sharp and astonished. And the 5 volunteers bowed their heads in relief, some with tears cutting down their cheeks. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the 70 warriors beyond the fire lifted their white feathers as one, a forest of pale, plumes rising into the night sky, and a chant rolled low and deep from their throats, a sound that seemed to rumble from the earth itself. Ayanna's grandfather rose to his feet, his old eyes shining not with cold judgment now, but with something closer to pride. And when he spoke, Ayanna's voice carried the words that struck Sterling like a thunderclap of mercy. No man has ever chosen to face all trials alone. Such willingness to die for others proves your heart. The trials end here. The horse gift is satisfied. You are declared our brother. Sterling sagged against the ropes, stunned, a mix of relief and disbelief, washing over him like rain on scorched ground. For he had been ready to die, yet instead found himself given something he had not known he sought: belonging, acceptance, a family bound not by blood but by honor. And in that moment the weight of 70 feathers felt heavier than any chain, and lighter than any burden he had ever carried. For a long moment after the elder's words, silence reigned in the circle, silence so profound that Sterling could hear the hiss of pitch burning in the torches, the restless shifting of horses at the perimeter, the faint intake of breath from those nearest the fire, and then, as if the night itself had exhaled, the 70 warriors moved as one, dismounting in unison with a grace that sent a chill down his spine, their boots striking the ground together, feathers trembling in the evening breeze, and they began to walk toward him. Not as predators descending on prey, but as men approaching. A brother returned from long absence, their faces solemn, their steps steady, until the first knelt before him, laying his white feather at Sterling's bound feet, the plume soft against the dust, a gesture that held more weight than steel or stone. And another followed, and another, until the carpet of pale feathers spread at his boots like snow fallen in midsummer, each one a pledge, each one a bond. And as the offerings grew, the men reached into their belts, their pouches, their saddlebags, and laid down gifts of their households, hand-forged knives with handles carved in patient detail, blankets woven tight with patterns of sun and river, jewelry wrought from bone and shell, small carvings shaped from cedar and stone, every piece laid with reverence, as if the act itself stitched him into their lives. Sterling watched, too stunned to speak, his throat locked with a mix of disbelief and awe, until his gaze caught on something that nearly broke him. The familiar glint of silver conchos, worn smooth from years of his father's use, now set into the bridle of his horse, led forward by the gray-haired warrior who had first confronted him on the ridge. The animal's ears flicked at the firelight, its dark eyes steady on Sterling, but what made his chest seize was the sight of new tech draped across its back, leather painted with symbols he could not read, yet whose meaning pressed into him as deeply as if carved in flesh. The warrior spoke then, in careful English, his voice low, but carrying to all. "White brother, we came to judge, to carry away body, or to welcome a man. We did not expect to find one worthy of the greatest honor. We know." Sterling's lips parted, but no words came. The weight of what had just been said rooted him in place, his mind still circling the edge of disbelief. But the elder stepped forward before he could find breath, Ayanna at his side. And when he laid both hands on Sterling's shoulders, his touch was steady as bedrock, his eyes filled with the gravity of a lifetime spent guiding his people. Ayanna's translation trembled as she gave the word shape. "You came to us as stranger who gave a gift. You leave as brother who receives 70 in return. Each feather is vow. Each gift is shelter, food, and defense as long as you draw breath. No Apache will raise hand against you, for you have shown the heart of our people." The words hit Sterling with the force of a blow, and yet carried a strange gentleness, a weight that was not burden but belonging. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir in him that had long been buried under dust and grief, the faint thrum of home, though it was a home he had never expected to find. The elder continued, his voice heavy with solemn joy, and Ayanna's eyes shone as she translated through tears she did not try to hide. "Few white men have ever known this honor, fewer still who were not born among us. You are now bound by the law you honored without knowing it. Our hearths are open to you, our warriors ride with you, our families call you brother." The chant of the warriors rose then, low and rhythmic, deep enough to make the ground itself seem to hum. And Sterling, still bound, still bewildered, felt tears sting his eyes, though he had thought himself long past weeping. And when the elder cut the ropes at his wrists with a swift stroke of the ornate knife, the freedom that surged through his arms was not only of flesh, but of spirit, as if chains unseen had broken as well. He flexed his hands, blood returning in hot rushes, And when he looked around, he no longer saw strangers with painted faces and feathers. He saw men who had tested him and found him true, women who had waited in silence to see if his heart would hold, children whose washid eyes no longer held fear, but a kind of bright wonder. Ayana stepped closer then, her limp slowing her stride, her dark eyes holding his without flinching, and in her gaze he saw not only gratitude, but recognition, as though she understood something of the storm inside him, something that had brought him to this place at this moment. And her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but clear. "You are no longer alone, Sterling Maddox." He drew a sharp breath at the sound of his own name on her lips, softer than he had ever heard it spoken, and felt the truth of her words echo against the hollow places inside him. When they brought him his horse, he ran a trembling hand along the animal's neck, felt the warmth of its hide, smelled the leather and sweat mingled with sage and paint. And in that instant, the creature was not merely his possession, returned but a symbol of what had been given back to him. A place in the world, a bond with people who had seen the worst of his heart and yet offered him their best. Around him, the night deepened, the stars brightened overhead, and the chant of 70 warriors rose and fell like the pulse of the earth itself. And Sterling Maddox, once a man wandering without tether, felt the truth settle in his chest like fire against cold. He had been judged, he had been found, and he had been claimed as brother by a people who asked nothing less than everything. And for the first time in all his years, he was willing to give it. The night had settled deep across the basin when Sterling finally mounted his horse again, the familiar weight of the saddle beneath him both comfort and strangeness. For though the animal was his own, returned with honor, it no longer carried the marks of his past, but the painted symbols of another people, lines and circles, drawn in colors that spoke of protection, sacrifice, and bond. And as his fingers traced them in the flicker of torchlight, he felt as though he were touching not leather, but the living proof of a covenant sealed in fire. And when he looked up from the tack, he saw the circle of warriors standing ready, feathers fastened now to bridles and hair, their silhouettes tall against the glow of firelight, their faces unreadable, yet softened with something he had not expected. Respect, the kind of respect that came not from fear or blood, but from recognition. And it settled into him like warmth against the long chill of solitude he had carried for years. The crowd had begun to thin, women leading children back to dwellings, elders dispersing into the shadows. Yet no one turned their back on him without first giving a nod, a gesture so small yet so profound that it left Sterling's throat tight, for he could not remember the last time anyone had looked at him as though he truly belonged. And when Ayana approached, limping slightly, yet holding herself with the same quiet strength that had first stayed his hand at the creek bed, she lifted her chin and met his gaze, her eyes glimmering in the light. "Where will you go now, brother?" she asked, the last word carrying the weight of ceremony and kinship, yet softened with something personal. And for a moment Sterling had no answer, only the memory of all the places he had left behind, his family's graves by the cottonwoods, the empty ranch house with its roof caved in by storms, the endless miles of trail that had carried him away from everything he had ever cared for. And now this place, unexpected, undeserved, yet more of a home than he had known in a decade. He cleared his throat, voice rough, and said, "North, maybe." toward the mountains. I hear there's good grazing land up there. His words felt small beside the weight of what had just transpired. But Ayana only nodded, her eyes shining with something between sorrow and relief, as though she had expected no less. Behind her, her grandfather stepped forward, laying a hand briefly on her shoulder before addressing Sterling, his voice low, his Apache thick with gravity that Ayana translated with care. You ride with more than a horse now. 70 families ride with you. Their feathers bind you. Their gifts protect you. Wherever you go, you carry us. Sterling swallowed hard, for the truth of those words pressed heavy on his chest. He had come into this land alone, expecting nothing but thirst and silence. And now he left carrying not just his own life, but the honor of 70 warriors, the promise of families who would take him in as brother, and the bond of a law older than any he had ever known. The warriors mounted in unison, their movements precise, and formed a ring around him, their presence both shield and escort, and as Sterling's horse shifted beneath him, he felt their nearness as a force more tangible than steel. Protection bound not by coin or contract, but by vow. The procession began to move slowly, the sound of hooves steady and rhythmic, and Sterling turned once in the saddle, looking back at the village nestled in the basin, the glow of fires dimming as families settled for the night, the smoke curling upward like prayers into the star-lit sky, and he knew he would never see it as an outsider again. Ahead, the trail wound out of the canyon, the night air crisp and filled with sage, the stars sharp as flint. And Sterling breathed deep, letting the scents and sounds fill the hollow places inside him. For the first time in years, the emptiness did not echo so loudly. He thought of his sister, of her words about courage, of how he had failed so many times before. And he felt a strange peace in knowing that, for once, he had not failed, that his act of giving, born of guilt and desperation, had been seen for what it was at its heart, and had been honored beyond anything he could have imagined. The white feathers tied to his saddle shifted in the breeze, their pale tips catching the starlight, and each time they stirred, he felt the weight of 70 oaths upon him, binding him to more than survival, binding him to a new way of being. As they rode out of the basin, the warriors chanting softly in a rhythm that matched the hoofbeats, Sterling felt a quiet resolve settle over him, a promise made not in words, but in the marrow of his bones, that wherever he went, whatever lay ahead in the mountains or the valleys, he would carry this bond with him, not as burden, but as honor, for he had been judged and not found wanting. And in that judgment, he had found something rarer than land or coin. He had found family. And as the canyon opened to the wide, dark plains, and the warriors' voices rose in unison beneath the stars, Sterling Maddox rode with them, no longer a solitary wanderer, but a man claimed, a man bound, a man whose heart had at last been given a place to rest. The mountains rose like dark sentinels against the horizon as the column of riders moved steadily north, their silhouettes cast in silver beneath a sky swollen with stars. And though Sterling rode at the center of the formation, flanked by warriors who had given their vow of protection, he felt less like a prisoner of ritual and more like a man whose life had been woven into a pattern he could not yet read. And with every mile, the weight of that truth pressed deeper into his chest, reshaping the hollow spaces he had carried for years, spaces carved by loneliness, grief, and the long silence of an empty trail. Now, when he glanced at the white feathers tied to his saddle, They stirred not as burden, but as reminder, each plume a whisper that he was no longer drifting rootless across a land too vast for one man to conquer alone. And though the thought filled him with unease, it also carried a strange, quiet comfort he had not known since boyhood, when his sister's laughter still warmed the cabin walls. And as the warrior's chant faded into the rhythm of hoofbeats, Sterling let his eyes rest on the line of Ayanna, riding near the elder at the column's front, her posture proud despite the limp that slowed her, her hair catching the starlighted strands of obsidian. And though she had spoken little since the ceremony ended, the memory of her voice, low, careful, carrying truths no one else had dared put into words, stayed with him, circling in his mind like a hawk that would not leave its prey. And he found himself wondering not about the trials he had escaped, but about the woman whose life had begun the chain that bound him now. He recalled the first moment he had seen her by the creek bed, her body frail with fever, yet her eyes holding that strange, resigned dignity. And he realized with a start that it was not only pity that had stayed his hand, but recognition. For in her gaze he had seen the same weight he carried, the knowledge of loss, the defiance of surrender. And it struck him now that perhaps his act of sacrifice had been less about saving her than about answering a call he had carried within himself all along. The trail narrowed between cliffs, stone rising cold and sheer on either side, and the sound of the warriors' horses echoed like drums, the heartbeat of earth itself, and Sterling's own horse followed with steady confidence, as though it too knew the weight of the symbols painted upon its tack. And for the first time in years, Sterling felt he was not leading, but being led, carried forward by something larger than himself. He thought of the elder's words, of how ignorance did not absolve him from the binding law, and he wondered if perhaps the laws of men had never been his to hold, that maybe he had always belonged to a law older, harsher, but truer, a law written not in books, but in the dust of trails and the bonds between lives saved and lives given. A gust of wind swept down the canyon, stirring the feathers, and he looked around at the men who rode with him, their faces set, their eyes forward, warriors who had tested him with the threat of death and then laid their trust at his feet. And the knowledge of that faith filled him with a fierce determination not to betray it. He thought of what it meant to carry 70 households' pledge, to know that doors would open to him in the worst storm, that fires would be stoked for him in the coldest night. And though he had never asked for such belonging, he felt the burden transform within him into purpose. He shifted in the saddle, drawing a long breath of the cold night air, scented with sage and dust, and found himself whispering beneath it all, not a prayer, but a promise to live in a way worthy of what had been given. When the column reached a ridge that overlooked a wide plain, the warriors halted, their silhouettes etched black against the stars. And the elder turned in his saddle to regard Sterling with a gaze that carried both command and kindness. Speaking words Ayanna translated softly as she drew closer, her horse stepping near his. The escort ends here. You know now that you ride not alone. Beyond this ridge, your path is yours to choose, but wherever you go, you carry us, and our eyes will find you when you need them most. Sterling felt his throat tighten as he nodded, unable to shape a reply that would hold the depth of what he carried. And Ayanna lingered a heartbeat longer, her dark eyes catching his with a mixture of gratitude and pity, as though she saw the weight of his solitude even beneath the honor he had gained. And she said quietly, "Some journeys do not end with the trail, Sterling Maddox. Some follow you no matter where you ride." Then she turned her horse back towards the basin, leaving him with the 70 riders who lifted their feathers one final time, a forest of pale plumes swaying beneath the stars, before they wheeled in perfect unison and rode away into the darkness, their chant fading like the last echoes of thunder after a storm. And Sterling sat his horse at the ridge, staring north to the mountains where his future waited, feeling both stripped bare and clothed anew, a man who had been tested by fire and silence, and who now carried in his heart the first fragile stirrings of something he had thought long dead, hope. The ridge lay quiet after the warrior's chant faded into the night, the silence so complete it seemed to swallow the air itself. And Sterling Maddox sat astride his horse, staring at the long sweep of land unrolling before him, the northern mountains dark against the stars, their peaks dusted in silver light. And though the world looked unchanged, he felt the shift inside him as sharp as a blade. He was no longer the same man who had wandered alone into Apache country, no longer the hollow figure drifting from one dry horizon to the next. He carried something now, something heavier than the weapons he had long since laid aside, heavier even than grief. For he carried 70 oaths and the memory of a circle where his heart had been laid bare. And he carried too the image of a woman's dark eyes, meeting his without fear, eyes that had haunted him since the creek bed and would not release him now. He nudged his horse forward, the animal moving steady under him, its tack creaking softly, the painted symbols glowing faint in the starlight. And every step felt like the first beat of a new life, though the shadows of the old one clung still to his shoulders. The plains stretched wide, sage and rock and darkness mingled, and with every breath Sterling felt the loneliness return. But it was no longer the hollow loneliness of a man unmoored. It was the ache of distance from something he had glimpsed and did not yet understand. Ayana's words echoed in him, quiet but sharp. Some journeys do not end with the trail. Some follow you no matter where you ride. He thought of her limp, of the way she had stood by her grandfather's side with dignity unshaken, of the way her voice had carried truth, even when it cut deep. And though she was now miles behind him, he felt her presence as though she rode beside him, watching, measuring, reminding him of the bond sealed by the law of the horse gift. He wondered if she pitied him for the emptiness she had seen in his eyes, or if she had glimpsed something more, something that even he had not yet dared name. The wind rose across the plain, carrying the smell of sage and dust, rattling the feathers tied to his saddle. And Sterling reached down, brushing one with his fingers, the plume soft against his calloused skin, and the weight of 70 warriors' vows pressed into him again, steadying him as the old ghosts threatened to return. He saw his sister's face in the shadows, pale and fading, her voice urging him towards courage. And for once, he did not turn from the memory, but let it sit beside him, no longer as a wound, but as a companion. The stars shifted overhead as the night deepened, and Sterling rode on, his mind circling like a hawk between the past he could not change and the future he had not chosen but could not refuse. And he found himself imagining, against his will, what it might mean to ride back one day to that basin, to hear the chant rise again, not in judgment, but in welcome, to see Ayana step forward with her proud eyes and her slow, steady stride, and to know that he was not merely guest, but something closer, something that tied not only his honor, but his heart. He shook his head at the thought, bitter at himself for letting it take root. For what place had he, a drifter with no land left to his name, beside a woman who bore the strength of her people like armor? Yet even as he tried to cast the notion aside, the memory of her voice and her gaze lingered, stubborn as the desert wind, and he realized that though the bond of brotherhood had been declared, something deeper had been planted in the silence between them, something unspoken but alive. His horse climbed a small rise, the land falling away into rolling dark below, and he reined in to look once more toward the distant basin, though nothing but shadow and starlight marked its place now. He breathed deep, letting the cold air cut his lungs, and whispered into the night, "I'll carry it. All of it." The words vanished into the wind, but he knew they bound him just as firmly as any rope. And with that vow, he turned his horse north again, toward the mountains, where the land promised hardship, danger, and perhaps a chance to build something new. The night closed around him, yet he no longer feared the silence, for within it he carried voices, the chant of 70 warriors, the judgment of elders, the echo of his sister, and above all the quiet strength of a woman who had looked at him with pity, yes, but also with something more, something that might yet draw him back when the trail ahead had been ridden and the mountains had given up their secrets. And so Sterling Maddox rode on, haunted still, but steadied, his solitude no longer empty but filled with the faint pulse of hope, fragile as a feather, strong as a vow. The days that followed were hard miles, the kind that stripped a man down to the sinew and left him with nothing but his own grit to carry him forward. And though Sterling Maddox had ridden trails like these all his life, they felt different now, as though each ridge, each river, each barren stretch of rock and sage were watching him, measuring whether he would live up to the 70 feathers tied to his saddle. And the thought alone was enough to keep him upright when hunger bit deep or thirst burned his throat raw. The northern plains opened wide before him, wind-swept and merciless, the sky stretching vast and mercurial. One day blue and endless, the next heavy with storm clouds that rolled black as coal across the horizon. And Sterling met each turn of the weather with the steady patience of a man who knew the land did not bend to will but to endurance. When wolves shadowed his camp at night, their eyes glinting red beyond the fire, he held his rifle close, though he had not lifted it in anger for years. And when hunger drove him to trap a rabbit or bring down a deer, he whispered thanks to the earth before taking the first cut of meat, a habit he had not known before, but which felt right now, as though the eyes of those 70 households were still upon him. And yet it was not only the land that tested him. On the third week north, as he followed the cut of a narrow valley where a stream trickled between boulders, he found himself shadowed by riders, 3 men rough with dust and trail grime, their eyes sharp with hunger of a different sort. They hailed him with false cheer, words slurred with whiskey even from the saddle, asking where he rode and what coin he carried. But Sterling saw the truth in their posture, the greedy way they measured his horse and the feather-tied bridle, and he knew what they intended. In years past, he might have turned silent, tried to ride on, or worse, reached for iron to settle the matter quick and brutal. But now he felt the weight of the feathers against his saddle, felt the vow of 70 warriors pressing on his back, and he drew himself tall in the saddle, meeting their gaze without flinch. "I carry nothing but what was given," he said evenly, his voice steady as the stream beside them. The men laughed, circling closer, one spitting into the dirt, but when they caught sight of the painted symbols on the tack, their laughter faltered. And though they did not understand the meaning, some deeper instinct seemed to seize them, some recognition that what they faced was not a man alone, but a man bound by something they could not touch. Sterling held their gaze, thinking not of his own skin, but of what it would mean to dishonor the vows he carried. And after a long moment of silence, one of the men cursed under his breath, turned his horse with a jerk, and the others followed. Their bravado withering into the dust, they kicked behind them. When they were gone, Sterling let out a breath he had not realized he held, his hands tight on the reins, and he looked down at the feather tied nearest his hand, brushing it with his thumb, whispering softly, "You ride with me still." That night, as the fire burned low and coyotes sang to the moon, Sterling sat staring into the embers, his mind circling, not around the riders, but around Ayanna. Her face rose in the glow, the memory of her eyes steady on him even in judgment. The way her voice had trembled when she spoke of sacrifice, yet never wavered in truth. He told himself it was only because she had been the first thread binding him to this new life, that she was the bridge between his world and hers. But the longer he stared into the fire, the less convincing the thought became, and he felt the ache of distance sharper than the ache of hunger. He wondered if she still thought of him, if she remembered the man who had handed her his only horse and stumbled on foot through the dust. And he found himself hoping, against reason, that she did. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain, and Sterling drew his coat tighter, and lying back on the hard earth with the stars above wheeling cold and bright. And for the first time in years, he did not feel like a man drifting nowhere. He felt tested, yes, by hunger, by riders with empty hearts, by the merciless sweep of land, but he also felt steadied, shaped, as though each trial were hammer strikes, forging him into something he had not been before. And when sleep finally came, it was with the memory of Ayanna's dark eyes resting gently against his own, her voice reminding him that some journeys follow no trail, yet bind a man all the same. And he carried that truth into his dreams, the echo of a bond he had not asked for but could no longer deny. The days turned into weeks as Sterling Maddox pressed deeper into the northern country, the land changing beneath his horse's hooves, from arid plains to foothills where pine and cedar clung stubborn to stone. And each morning when he woke beneath the raw light of dawn, he found himself listening not only for the wind and the cry of hawks, but for the memory of voices, 70 men chanting in unison, children's laughter by firelight, Ayanna's words carried with steady conviction. And though no one rode at his side now, he no longer felt alone, for the bond he had been given clung to him like a mantle, shaping every choice, every breath. When he came upon settlers' wagons stalled in mud, he offered his strength without thought, his hands on the wheels until shoulders ached, the family staring at the feathers tied to his bridle with wide, uncertain eyes. And though they asked no questions, he saw respect soften their suspicion, as if some instinct told them he carried more than himself. At night, as he sat by fire with smoke curling into stars, he would catch himself tracing the painted symbols on his horse's tack, not out of doubt, but out of reverence. Each line a reminder that his life no longer belonged solely to his own keeping, that he rode with promises heavier than coin, and with each stroke of his hand across leather, he felt the burden transform, not into chains but into roots, anchoring him in a soil he had once believed forever closed to him. And still, Ayana lingered in his mind with a quiet insistence that unsettled him more than hunger or storm. He remembered the firmness of her jaw as she translated her grandfather's judgments, the sorrow in her voice when she explained the price of sacrifice, the way her dark eyes had looked at him not as savior, but as man revealed, bare, flawed, yet unbroken. He told himself it was folly to think of her, that she was bound to her people as surely as the stars to the sky. Yet in the still hours before sleep, he would imagine riding back, imagine her stepping from the shadows of a fire, her limp forgotten as she crossed the space between them, and the image carried a warmth that no blanket could give. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon and shadows stretched long, Sterling found himself at the edge of a cliff, the valley below awash with golden light, and he realized he was no longer watching the land with the eyes of a drifter, but with the eyes of a man seeking a place to root, to build, to breathe. The thought startled him, for he had long sworn never to tie himself again to earth that could be lost. Yet now, with 70 families' protection promised, and the faint memory of Ayana's voice echoing in his chest, the idea did not feel like a trap, but like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. He whispered aloud to the empty air, "Maybe it's time." And the wind seemed to carry the words down into the valley, where the scent of pine and river rose like an answer. That night he dreamed of Ayana again, not fevered or wounded, but standing beside him in the half-light, her hand brushing a feather tied to his saddle, her eyes meeting his with a question unspoken but clear. And he woke with his heart pounding, the embers of the fire glowing low, and knew that what bound him to her people was not only law, but longing. When dawn came, he rode with new purpose, each mile carrying him closer not to escape, but to belonging. And though the mountains loomed high and forbidding, he felt steadier than he had in years, his past no longer chasing him, but walking beside him, softened by the voices of those who had judged him worthy. And somewhere in the hidden basin far behind, Ayana moved through her days with that same proud bearing. And Sterling told himself that if the trail should ever lead him back to her, he would not ride past as stranger but as man who had found in her eyes the first flicker of something that might yet grow into love. The mountains rose closer with every mile, their jagged peaks etched in white where snow clung stubborn, even against the spring sun. And as Sterling Maddox rode beneath their looming presence, he felt the road behind him and the road ahead folding into one, as though every choice, every scar, every step of loneliness had led to this place where past and future met. He thought often of the stone circle, of the firelight that had revealed him to strangers who became kin, of the white feathers laid at his feet like snow, and of the elder's hand steady on his shoulder, declaring him brother. Those memories did not drift away like so many of his life's passing moments. They lived within him, burning steady as coals, and with each dawn he woke beneath their warmth. Yet what surprised him most was not the weight of 70 oaths or the honor of a people he had once feared. It was the quiet persistence of a single face. Ayana's eyes returned to him in every silence, in every moment when the trail stretched too long, and the wind carried nothing but its own voice. He recalled the way she had looked at him on the ridge, torn between gratitude and pity, and how her words had lingered in his heart like scripture. Some journeys do not end with the trail. Some follow you no matter where you ride. He had ridden far, yet she followed still, not in body but in the tether of thought. And though Sterling told himself he had no right to think of her, he could not untangle her from the new life that had been forced upon him like a gift he had never dared imagine. The land itself seemed to test his resolve, for in the valleys wolves prowled and storms broke with fury. And once he nearly lost his horse, crossing a river swollen with meltwater, the current dragging at the animal's legs, until Sterling threw himself into the freezing torrent, hands clinging to the reins until he was dragged gasping onto the opposite bank. As he lay on the stones, his body shaking, he looked at the feathers tied to the saddle and whispered a prayer he had not known he carried, that he might be worthy of the bond they represented, that he might live not only for himself, but for those who had trusted him without demand. He began to move differently after that, not with the aimless tread of a drifter, but with the steady purpose of a man who knew the ground beneath his feet mattered, each decision a thread in the fabric of something larger. And with that purpose came a stirring of hope, fragile yet insistent, like green shoots pushing through frost. He began to imagine what it might mean to find a hollow in the mountains where water ran clear, where grass grew thick, where a man could set posts in the earth and call it his own, not as a solitary hermit fading into dust, but as a man whose hearth might one day burn with voices and laughter, with belonging. In those imaginings, Ayana's face appeared not as vision of pity, but as woman of strength, her eyes steady, her hand perhaps brushing against his. And though the thought shamed him for its presumption, it also lifted him, gave his long rides the shape of destination. One evening, as the sun died crimson across the sky and the peaks caught fire with its last light, Sterling dismounted and stood staring at the horizon, the white feathers on his saddle stirring in the breeze. He thought of the oath he had whispered into the dark, "I'll carry it, all of it," and realized that it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a beginning. He knew the world beyond these ridges would not soften. There would still be hunger, storm, and men with empty hearts who preyed upon the weary. But he also knew that he would never again face them as the hollow man who had once wandered into Apache country with nothing but a tired horse and a trail of regrets. He had been broken open and bound anew, given family where he had none, given honor where he had lost it, and perhaps, though time and distance yet divided them, given a thread of something more, spun in the quiet space between himself and Ayana. As the stars rose sharp and cold, Sterling built his fire and sat with the crackle filling the silence. And for the first time, he did not feel the ache of emptiness gnawing at him. Instead, he felt the land watching, the feathers whispering, and the pulse of a heart that had been tested by fire and had emerged steady. He lifted his gaze to the mountains and smiled faintly, the expression strange on his weathered face, and whispered, "North it is. To the grazing land, to what waits." And with that, Sterling Maddox lay down for the night, the white feathers shifting in the wind above his horse, the embers glowing warm, and the promise of dawn stretching before him like a trail without end. He had come as stranger, judged as wanderer, and left as brother. And whatever else the mountains held, he knew now that he rode not alone, but as man bound by honor, shaped by sacrifice, and carried forward by the faint, unyielding flame of hope.